Picture this. A young American sailor stands on the deck of a Chinese warship in 1863, thousands of miles from home, watching cannonballs tear through enemy vessels as he fights in a war that isn't his own. He's not a prisoner. He's not lost. He's being paid handsomely to be there, and he's one of dozens, maybe hundreds, of American mercenaries who sold their skills to foreign navies across the globe. This is the hidden story of American naval mercenaries, the men who took their expertise, their courage, and sometimes their moral compass, and placed them in the service of nations most Americans had never even heard of. These weren't traitors, at least not in the legal sense, and they weren't always adventurers either. They were sailors caught between opportunity and desperation, ambition and survival, in an era when the seas belonged to whoever could man a gun and navigate by the stars. The history of American sailors serving in foreign navies is one of the most overlooked chapters in American military history. We talk about the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, the World Wars, but we rarely discuss the men who left American shores and fought under flags bearing dragons, suns, and colors most Americans would never recognize. From the coasts of China to the harbors of Latin America, from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, American sailors became guns for hire, technical advisors, commanders, and sometimes even legends. Their stories are filled with danger, betrayal, riches, and ruin. And today we're going to dive deep into this world, a world where loyalty was negotiable, where skill meant survival, and where the line between hero and mercenary was thinner than the horizon at dawn. Let's begin with the question that might be on your mind. Why would an American sailor leave the United States Navy or the merchant marine to serve a foreign power? The answers are as varied as the men themselves. Some sought fortune. Naval service in the mid to late 1800s wasn't particularly lucrative for enlisted men. Pay was low, conditions were harsh, and advancement was slow unless you had connections or education. Foreign navies, especially those in nations building or modernizing their fleets, offered significantly higher wages. In some cases, an American sailor could earn 5 or 10 times what he'd make back home. That kind of money was life-changing, enough to buy land, start a business, or support a family in ways that would have been impossible on a deckhand's salary. Others were driven by adventure. The world in the 1800s was a place of dramatic change and conflict. Empires were rising and falling, new nations were being born, and technology was transforming warfare. For a young man with salt in his veins and a hunger to see the world, the opportunity to participate in these historic events, to be at the center of the action rather than reading about it in a newspaper months later, was irresistible. Some of these men were idealists, believers in the causes they fought for, while others simply craved the thrill of combat and the chaos of the unknown. Then there were those who had no choice. Desertion from the United States Navy or merchant ships was not uncommon. Conditions on American vessels could be brutal. Flogging, poor food, disease, and tyrannical officers drove many men to jump ship in foreign ports. Once a deserter, returning home meant facing court-martial and imprisonment. So these men found themselves stranded in distant lands, needing work, and possessing a skill set that was highly valued. Foreign naval recruiters were often more than happy to look the other way regarding a man's past if he could handle a cannon or navigate a ship. Let's talk about China first, because this is where some of the most dramatic stories unfold. During the mid-1800s, China was in chaos. The Qing dynasty was crumbling under the weight of internal rebellions and external pressures from Western powers. The Taiping Rebellion, which lasted from 1850 to 1864, was one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, claiming somewhere between 20 and 30 million lives. The Qing government, desperate to survive, turned to foreign assistance. They hired Western military advisors and mercenaries to help modernize their forces and put down the rebellions. Among these foreigners were American sailors. One of the most famous was Frederick Townsend Ward. Ward was born in Salem, Massachusetts, in 1831. He went to sea as a young man and eventually found his way to China in the 1850s. Ward was ambitious, charismatic, and fearless. He recognized the opportunity that the chaos in China presented. In 1860, he formed a mercenary army known as the Ever-Victorious Army, funded by Chinese merchants and later supported by the Qing government. Ward trained his force using Western military tactics and armed them with modern rifles and artillery. The ever-victorious army scored significant victories against the Taiping rebels, and Ward became a hero to the Qing. Ward's force included not just Chinese soldiers, but also American, British, and Filipino mercenaries. American sailors were particularly valued for their gunnery skills and discipline. These men operated artillery, trained troops, and led assaults. Ward himself was wounded multiple times in combat and finally killed in battle in 1862 at the age of 30. The Qing government honored him with titles and ceremonies, something almost unheard of for a foreigner. His grave in China became a site of respect, and his legacy, though controversial, highlighted the impact American mercenaries could have in foreign conflicts. But Ward wasn't alone. Other American sailors and officers joined the ever-victorious Army or served in similar capacities. Some did it for the money, others for the adventure, and a few because they genuinely believed in the cause of supporting the Qing against what they saw as a destructive rebellion. The experience of fighting in China was brutal. Disease, especially cholera and dysentery, killed as many men as combat. The fighting itself was savage, with little regard for the rules of war. Prisoners were often executed, cities were razed, and atrocities were common on both sides. For an American sailor used to the relatively structured warfare of the era, China was a descent into a different kind of hell. After the Taiping Rebellion ended, some of these American mercenaries stayed in China, taking positions in the Chinese Navy or as advisors to regional warlords. Others moved on, carrying their experience and their scars to the next conflict, the next payday. The presence of Americans in Chinese military service continued sporadically into the early 20th century, though never again at the scale seen during the Taiping era. Now let's shift our focus to Latin America, a region that saw perhaps the most sustained and widespread use of American naval mercenaries. Throughout the 19th century, Latin America was a cauldron of revolution, civil war, and international conflict. Nations were fighting for independence from Spain and Portugal, then fighting each other over borders and resources, and then fighting internally as different factions struggled for power. Navies were crucial in these conflicts. Control of the seas meant control of trade, the ability to blockade enemy ports, and the capacity to move troops and supplies. But many Latin American nations lacked the naval tradition and expertise to build and operate effective fleets. Enter the American sailors. Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Peru, Mexico, and many other nations actively recruited American sailors and officers. These men served in a variety of roles. Some were gun captains, responsible for the operation of naval artillery. Others were navigators, pilots, engineers, and even ship captains. A few rose to the rank of admiral, commanding entire fleets in wars that shaped the future of the continent. The pay was good, sometimes excellent, and the opportunities for advancement were far greater than in the United States Navy, which was relatively small and peacetime-oriented for much of the 1800s. One of the most fascinating examples is the case of American sailors in the Brazilian Navy. Brazil fought several wars in the 19th century, most notably the War of the Triple Alliance from 1864 to 1870, in which Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay fought against Paraguay. The Brazilian Navy played a critical role in this conflict, and American sailors were prominent among its ranks. Some had originally come to Brazil as crew on merchant ships and decided to stay. Others were actively recruited by Brazilian agents in American ports. These men brought with them knowledge of steam engines, rifled cannons, and modern naval tactics, all of which gave Brazil a significant advantage. Life for an American sailor in the Brazilian Navy could be quite comfortable, at least compared to the alternatives. Brazil offered good pay, opportunities for prize money from captured enemy ships, and the chance to settle in a rapidly growing nation. Some Americans married Brazilian women, started families, and never returned to the United States. Others served for a few years, saved their money, and went home. But the work was dangerous. Naval combat in the 1860s was brutal and chaotic. Wooden ships armed with explosive shells could be turned into floating infernos in minutes. Disease was rampant in the tropical climate, and yellow fever killed more sailors than enemy fire. Argentina also made extensive use of American sailors, particularly during its wars with Brazil and its internal conflicts. The Argentine Navy in the mid-1800s was a mixed force of locally built ships and captured or purchased foreign vessels. American sailors were prized for their technical skills and were often placed in key positions. Some became legends in Argentina, celebrated for their bravery and skill. Others were forgotten, their names lost to history, their graves unmarked in foreign soil. Mexico presents another interesting case. During the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848, American sailors obviously fought for the United States. But in the decades after, during the various civil wars and the French intervention in the 1860s, American sailors could be found on multiple sides of the conflicts. Some served the Mexican government, others joined rebel forces, and a few even served in the navy of the short-lived Second Mexican Empire under Emperor Maximilian. The reasons were the same as elsewhere: money, adventure, and opportunity. Mexico's long coastlines and strategic ports made naval power important, and American expertise was valued. One particularly colorful character was a sailor named Henry Augustus Wise. Wise had served in the United States Navy and later became a mercenary and adventurer. He fought in Central America during the filibuster expeditions of the 1850s, private military campaigns aimed at conquering territory in Latin America. Wise and men like him represented a more aggressive form of American naval mercenary activity, one that sometimes bordered on piracy and was often motivated by dreams of personal empire as much as financial gain. The filibuster expeditions deserve special mention because they represent a unique and controversial chapter in this history. In the 1850s, several American adventurers, most notably William Walker, launched private military campaigns to conquer parts of Central America. These expeditions were illegal under United States law, but they attracted hundreds of American volunteers, including many sailors and naval veterans. Walker actually succeeded in taking control of Nicaragua for a brief period and declared himself president. American sailors played crucial roles in these campaigns, operating ships, conducting amphibious landings, and fighting naval battles against local forces and rival filibusters. The filibuster expeditions were motivated by a mix of factors including the expansion of slavery, personal ambition, and genuine belief in manifest destiny, the idea that American-style governance and culture should spread across the hemisphere. They were also driven by economic interests, as control of Central American territory could mean control of potential canal routes between the Atlantic and Pacific. The expeditions ultimately failed, and men like Walker were executed or died in combat. But the American sailors who participated in these ventures were true mercenaries in every sense, fighting for personal gain and ideological goals outside the framework of official United States policy. Beyond Latin America and China, American sailors also served in other foreign navies, though in smaller numbers. During the various conflicts in the Mediterranean in the 19th century, American sailors could be found serving in the navies of Greece, Turkey, and Egypt. The Greek War of Independence in the 1820s attracted American volunteers, including sailors inspired by classical Greece and the cause of freedom. Some of these men were motivated by Philhellenism, a romantic love of Greek culture, while others were simply looking for work and adventure. Egypt under Muhammad Ali and his successors in the mid-1800s was modernizing rapidly and building a powerful navy. American naval officers and sailors were recruited to help train Egyptian crews and operate new steam-powered warships. The pay was good, and the opportunity to live in Egypt, with its ancient wonders and strategic importance, appealed to some. However, service in the Egyptian Navy could also be frustrating. Corruption was rampant, pay was sometimes delayed, and the political situation was unstable. Some Americans left after short stints, while others stayed for years. The question of loyalty is central to understanding these men. Were they betraying their country by serving foreign powers? The answer is complicated. In the 19th century, the concept of exclusive national loyalty was not as rigid as it would become later. Many nations did not prohibit their citizens from serving in foreign militaries during peacetime, and the United States was no exception for much of this period. American sailors serving in foreign navies during conflicts that did not involve the United States were generally not considered traitors, though they could face legal consequences if they fought against American forces or interests. However, there were limits. During the American Civil War, the question of American sailors serving in foreign navies took on a more serious dimension. Both the Union and the Confederacy sought to build or purchase warships abroad, and both employed American sailors in foreign shipyards and on foreign-built vessels. Confederate agents in Britain and France worked to recruit American sailors for ships like the CSS Alabama, which was built in Britain and operated as a Confederate commerce raider. The Union government protested vigorously, arguing that British neutrality was being violated. The situation was complex and politically charged, and it highlighted the ambiguous legal status of American mercenaries. After the Civil War, as the United States began to emerge as a more centralized nation-state and a growing international power, attitudes toward Americans serving in foreign militaries began to shift. There was increasing concern that American military expertise was being used in ways that might harm American interests. Laws were passed to restrict or prohibit certain types of foreign military service, though enforcement was inconsistent. By the early 20th century, the era of the American naval mercenary was beginning to fade. The reasons for this decline were multiple. The professionalization and expansion of the United States Navy provided more opportunities at home, reducing the incentive to seek service abroad. International law and diplomatic norms evolved to discourage the use of mercenaries. Nationalist sentiment grew stronger, and serving a foreign power became more socially and legally problematic. Technology also played a role. As naval warfare became more complex, requiring specialized training on specific systems and ships, the days of the generalist sailor who could jump from one navy to another began to end. But the legacy of these men endures. American naval mercenaries played significant roles in shaping the history of many nations. They helped modernize navies, train generations of foreign sailors, and participated in conflicts that determined the fate of countries and regions. Their technical skills and combat experience were genuine contributions, even if their motivations were often mercenary. Some became heroes in their adopted countries, honored and remembered. Others died forgotten, buried in unmarked graves far from home. It's important to recognize the moral complexity of these stories. These were not simple tales of adventure and heroism. Many of these men participated in wars that were brutal and unjust. They fought for causes that included the suppression of independence movements, the defense of authoritarian regimes, and the expansion of colonial power. Some committed or witnessed atrocities. The money they earned was often blood money, paid for their willingness to kill and risk death in conflicts that were not their own. We should not romanticize their choices or ignore the suffering they helped inflict. At the same time, we should try to understand these men in the context of their times. Life in the 19th century was hard, especially for working-class men. Opportunities were limited, and survival often required making difficult choices. For a sailor, the sea was both livelihood and prison. Naval service, whether in the United States or abroad, was a brutal profession. These men lived in a world where violence was more commonplace, where national boundaries were more fluid, and where the concept of a career could mean moving from one employer to another, regardless of nationality. The stories of individual American naval mercenaries are often remarkable. Take the case of a sailor we'll call John, a composite based on several real individuals. John was born in New York in 1835 to a poor family. He went to sea at 14 as a cabin boy on a merchant ship. By his early 20s, he had sailed to China, South America, and Europe. He was skilled, hardworking, and ambitious, but opportunities in the United States Navy were limited for a man without connections. In 1860, John found himself in Chile, where he learned that the Chilean Navy was recruiting. The pay was triple what he could earn on a merchant ship, and there was the possibility of advancement. He signed on. John served in the Chilean Navy for 5 years. He participated in a war against Spain, operated modern rifled cannons, and survived 2 ship sinkings. He saved enough money to return to the United States, but he found civilian life dull and struggled to find work that matched his skills. In 1867, he signed on with the Brazilian Navy and fought in the final years of the War of the Triple Alliance. He was promoted to petty officer and earned a small fortune in prize money. In 1870, John returned to the United States for good, bought a small farm, married, and lived quietly until his death in 1895. He never talked much about his years as a mercenary, and his children only learned the full story after his death when they found his old naval papers and medals from Chile and Brazil. Stories like John's were probably common, though most left no record. These were ordinary men who made extraordinary choices, who lived lives of adventure and danger, and who then tried to return to normalcy. Some succeeded, others did not. Alcoholism, poverty, and the psychological scars of combat claimed many. The transition from the intensity of war to the routine of peacetime was often difficult, especially for men who had spent years living on adrenaline and high stakes. The role of race in the story of American naval mercenaries is also worth exploring. The United States Navy in the 19th century was segregated and racist, with limited opportunities for black sailors, though they were present throughout the period. Some black American sailors found better treatment and more opportunities in foreign navies. Latin American nations, while not free of racism, often had more fluid racial categories and greater acceptance of racial mixing. A black American sailor might find that in Brazil or Argentina, his skills were valued more than his skin color, at least in a military context. Some black American sailors rose to positions of authority in foreign navies that would have been impossible in the United States Navy of that era. Similarly, the experience of American naval mercenaries varied by nationality and ethnicity. Sailors of Irish descent, who faced discrimination in the United States, sometimes found better opportunities abroad. The same was true for sailors from other immigrant communities. The foreign navy became a kind of escape from the rigid social hierarchies of American society, a place where competence and courage could matter more than background, at least in theory. Women also appear in these stories, though much more rarely. A few American women disguised themselves as men and served in foreign navies, just as some had done in the American Civil War. Others followed the fleets as nurses, laundresses, or wives of sailors. The stories of these women are even more fragmentary than those of the men, but they remind us that the world of naval mercenaries was not exclusively male, even if it was overwhelmingly so. As we move into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the nature of American involvement in foreign navies began to change. The Spanish-American War of 1898 marked the emergence of the United States as a genuine naval power with a modern, powerful fleet. American sailors now had less reason to seek service abroad. At the same time, American naval advisors and technical experts began to be sent abroad in official capacities as part of formal military assistance programs. This was a different kind of service, sanctioned by the government and part of broader diplomatic and strategic goals. During the Mexican Revolution from 1910 to 1920, American sailors and naval veterans were involved on various sides, but now their presence was more controversial and more closely monitored by the United States government. The era of the freewheeling mercenary was ending, replaced by a more regulated and official form of military assistance. By World War I, the idea of an American serving in a foreign navy without official sanction had become problematic, and during World War II, it was largely impossible due to the total mobilization of American society and the strict control of military expertise. However, the tradition did not die completely. During the Cold War, American military advisors served in allied navies around the world, training sailors and transferring technology. While these were official programs, some of the advisors operated in gray areas, and a few Americans served in foreign militaries in more clandestine capacities. The Vietnam War era saw some American veterans join foreign forces, and in more recent decades, private military contractors have filled a role that has some similarities to the mercenaries of the 19th century, though in a very different legal and political context. What lessons can we draw from the history of American naval mercenaries? First, it reminds us that national identity and loyalty have not always been as clear-cut as we might assume. In an era before mass media, before instant communication, and before the modern nation-state had fully consolidated, individuals had more freedom to define their own allegiances. Second, it shows us that military skill has always been a commodity, something that can be bought and sold. The men who served in foreign navies were exercising a kind of agency, making choices about how to use their abilities and whom to serve. We may judge those choices, but we should also recognize the constrained circumstances in which they were made. Third, this history highlights the global nature of naval warfare and maritime culture in the 19th century. The seas connected the world in ways that we sometimes forget. An American sailor could find himself in China, Chile, or Egypt with relative ease, and the skills he learned on one ship could be applied on another, regardless of the flag it flew. The ocean was a highway, and sailors were its travelers, moving from conflict to conflict, from opportunity to opportunity. Fourth, the story of American naval mercenaries complicates our understanding of American military history. We tend to focus on official wars and sanctioned military actions, but there was always this shadow world of unofficial service, of Americans fighting in foreign conflicts for a complex mix of motives. These men were part of American military history, even if they operated outside its formal boundaries. As we come to the end of our journey through this hidden history, it's worth reflecting on the individuals themselves. Behind the statistics and the strategic analysis were real people. Men who felt the roll of the deck under their feet, who smelled gunpowder and blood, who watched friends die and enemies fall. Men who wrote letters home that might take months to arrive if they arrived at all. Men who dreamed of glory or wealth or simply survival. Men who were far from home, fighting in wars they often barely understood, for nations that were not their own. Some of these men found what they were looking for. They made their fortunes, had their adventures, and returned home with stories that amazed and sometimes horrified their listeners. Others found only death or disillusionment. They died of disease in tropical ports, were killed in battle thousands of miles from anyone who knew their names, or survived but were broken by what they had experienced. And some never came home at all, choosing to build new lives in the countries they had served, becoming part of the fabric of those societies. The history of American mercenaries and foreign navies is ultimately a history about choice and consequence. It's about men who chose to step outside the boundaries of conventional life and who paid the price for better or worse. It's about the fluidity of the 19th century world, before nationalism hardened into its modern form, before technology made expertise so specialized that it couldn't be easily transferred, before international law and diplomatic norms curtailed the freedom of individuals to sell their military skills. Today, we live in a very different world. The idea of an American sailor simply deciding to join the Chinese or Chilean or Brazilian Navy seems almost fantastical. Our identities are more fixed, our allegiances more closely monitored, and the legal frameworks governing military service are far more restrictive. But the impulses that drove those 19th century sailors, the desire for adventure, for wealth, for purpose, for escape, those impulses are still with us. They find different outlets now, but they are part of the human condition. So the next time you think about American military history, remember the mercenaries. Remember the sailors who served under foreign flags, who operated guns on Chinese warships, who commanded vessels in Latin American wars, who died far from home in conflicts most Americans never heard about. They were part of our story too, a forgotten chapter in the long history of Americans at war. Their legacy is complex, morally ambiguous, and fascinating. They remind us that history is never as simple as we'd like it to be, and that the men and women who lived it were making choices in circumstances we can barely imagine. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the world of American naval mercenaries. This is a history that deserves to be remembered, discussed, and understood. These men shaped nations and conflicts across the globe, and their stories, though often hidden, are an essential part of understanding both American history and the history of naval warfare in the 19th century. They were adventurers and opportunists, heroes and villains, victims and perpetrators. They were, in the end, deeply human, navigating a world of violence and change with the tools they had, making choices that would echo through their lives and into history.